Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my husband walked out the door with a younger woman, I thought that was the worst thing he could do to me. Then I discovered he'd emptied our bank accounts. But when he came for the house, he didn't know about the secret I'd been keeping, and it changed everything. I never thought my life would turn into a bad soap opera, but that's exactly what it felt like the day my husband, David, came home and told me he was leaving. He didn't try to soften the blow. There were no awkward pauses or apologies. Just a flat statement that hit me like a freight train. I've met someone else. It took me a moment to respond, the words not fully registering. What? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I've met someone else, he repeated, his tone disturbingly casual, as if he were mentioning that he'd forgotten to pick up milk on the way home. I stared at him, trying to process the words. We've been married for 15 years. 15 years of building a life together, sharing dreams and sacrifices. We'd made it through tough times, tight finances, career changes, and even the loss of my mother. And now, he was throwing it all away for someone else? How long? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He hesitated, looking down at his hands for just a moment before answering. A few months. A few months. My mind reeled at the thought. While I'd been working late to finish projects at the office, while I'd been planning our next vacation, while I'd been picking out his birthday gift, he'd been with her. What's her name? I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. Jessica, he said, finally meeting my eyes. Jessica. The name hung in the air like a curse. It didn't matter who she was. Her name was already etched into the foundation of everything that was crumbling around me. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers that would make this make sense. But all I could do was sit there, numb, as he started gathering his things. You're leaving? I asked, unable to hide the disbelief in my voice. He shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I think it's best if I stay with her for a while. I watched him pack a small overnight bag, my chest tightening with every item he tossed inside. He didn't look at me, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't even seem to care. When he finally zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder, he paused at the door. I'll call you in a few days to talk about the details, he said. The details. Like this was some kind of business arrangement, like he was terminating a contract instead of walking out on a 15-year marriage. I didn't say anything as he walked out the door. I didn't have the words. All I could do was stand there, frozen, listening to the sound of his car engine fading into the distance. It wasn't until the house fell completely silent that the tears came. They weren't the quiet, dignified tears of someone who had been wronged. They were the raw, gut-wrenching sobs of someone whose entire world had just been shattered. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of the life we'd built together. The wedding photo on the mantel, the throw blanket we'd bought on our anniversary trip to the mountains, the coffee mug he'd given me with the words "best wife" ever printed in bold letters. Each item felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how blind I'd been. I thought we were happy. Sure, we had our problems, what couple didn't? But I never imagined he'd do something like this. As the hours dragged on, anger began to creep in, mingling with the sadness. How dare he? How dare he throw away everything we had without a second thought? And for what, a younger woman with a pretty face and no history? By the time the sun started to rise, I wasn't crying anymore. My tears had dried, leaving only the hollow ache of betrayal and a simmering determination that I didn't fully understand yet. Because while David might have thought he could walk out of my life without consequences, he was about to learn that I wasn't as easy to discard as he thought. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The morning after David left, I woke up with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of dread. The night before had been a blur of tears and sleepless hours, but by morning, my sadness had hardened into a grim determination. I needed to get a grip on my situation. If David was gone, I had to figure out how to move forward without him. My first instinct was to check our finances. For all his faults, David had always been responsible about money, or so I thought. I logged into our joint bank account, expecting to see the savings we'd built up over the years. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be our safety net. When the page loaded, my stomach sank. The balance was zero. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch in the system or some kind of oversight. I refreshed the page, but the numbers didn't change. Frantic, I logged into our other accounts. The savings account, empty. The investment portfolio, liquidated. Even the emergency fund, The one we'd agreed never to touch unless it was an absolute crisis, was gone. My hands shook as I sat back, staring at the screen in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. David had already blindsided me by walking out. But this, draining every penny we had, it was like a second betrayal, one that hit just as hard as the first. The initial shock quickly gave way to anger. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers trembling with rage. He picked up on the third ring, his voice annoyingly calm. "Hello. What the hell, David?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You emptied our accounts? How am I supposed to live?" "You'll be fine," he said, his tone so casual it made my blood boil. "The house is worth a lot. Sell it if you have to." "Are you serious right now?" I asked, incredulous. "You can't just take everything and expect me to fend for myself. It's not like I left you with nothing," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have the house. That's more than most people get." I was so furious I couldn't speak. He'd left me with a house. Our house, the one we'd bought together and filled with memories, and somehow thought that made up for stealing everything else. Before I could respond, he added, "Look, I don't have time for this right now. I'll call you in a few days." Then he hung up, leaving me with nothing but a dial tone and a growing sense of despair. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, clutching the phone in my hand and staring at the empty accounts on my screen. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I was truly on my own. For the first time in 15 years, there was no backup plan, no partner to lean on. Every decision, every responsibility was now mine alone. It was terrifying and overwhelming. But beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else, resolve. I wasn't going to let David win. He might have taken our money, our marriage, and my sense of security, but he wasn't going to take everything. I still had the house, and I was going to use it as my foundation to rebuild. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and paperwork. I contacted the bank to confirm what I already knew. David had transferred every cent to an account in his name. Legally, there was nothing I could do. Our joint accounts meant he had equal access to the funds. I also met with a financial advisor, who confirmed that my situation was dire. With no savings and limited income, I was living on borrowed time. "You'll need to make some tough decisions," she said gently, her sympathetic smile doing little to ease the knot in my stomach. But even as the reality of my situation set in, I refused to give up. If David thought he could leave me with nothing, he was sorely mistaken. I started making a list of priorities. First, I needed to cut back on expenses. I canceled every subscription, downgraded my phone plan, and sold anything that wasn't essential. Next, I looked for ways to bring in extra income. I picked up freelance work and started selling handmade crafts online. Small steps, but they gave me a sense of control. Through it all, I clung to one thought: the house. It was my last remaining asset, and I was determined to protect it at all costs. David might have left me with nothing, but I wasn't going to let him take my future. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above his betrayal and build something better. I didn't know it yet, but the house was about to become the key to everything. And David was in for a rude awakening. The days after discovering the empty accounts felt like a waking nightmare. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of David and the life we'd spent 15 years building together. The wedding photo on the mantle, the furniture we'd picked out during our first year of marriage, even the dent in the kitchen table from that time. We'd played a game of charades so intense that we doubled over laughing. At first, I couldn't move anything. Every item felt like a relic of a life that had been stolen from me, a life I wasn't ready to let go of. But the longer I sat in that house, surrounded by ghosts of what used to be, the heavier it all felt. I had moments where I let myself sink into the sadness, replaying conversations in my head and wondering what I could have done differently. But no matter how many times I went over it, the conclusion was the same. David's betrayal wasn't about me. It was about him. And while that realization didn't make the hurt disappear, it gave me something I desperately needed: perspective. After a few days, the fog of despair began to lift, replaced by a clearer sense of what needed to be done. I couldn't wallow forever. David had left me with nothing but a house, and if I wanted to keep it, I'd need to fight for it. I sat down at the kitchen table, armed with a notepad and a calculator, and took stock of what I had. The house was my biggest asset, and while the mortgage had been paid off years ago, the property taxes and utilities were still a hefty burden. Thankfully, David hadn't touched my personal account, a modest stash of savings I'd kept in my name for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it gave me a small safety net. And then there was my job, which barely covered the bills, but at least provided a steady paycheck. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. The next step was finding ways to stretch every dollar. I went through the house room by room, identifying anything I didn't absolutely need. Clothes, old electronics, furniture. If it wasn't essential, it went up for sale. I listed items online, held a garage sale, and even reached out to friends to see if they were interested in anything. At first, it was hard letting go of things that had once been part of my home. The dining set we'd picked out together, the decorative vases from our anniversary trip to Italy. They all held memories that felt too precious to part with. But the more I sold, the lighter I felt. Each item that left the house was one less reminder of David and the life he'd abandoned. And every dollar I earned was a step closer to financial stability. Despite my efforts, the bills kept piling up. The property taxes were due soon, and the utilities were higher than I'd anticipated. I picked up extra hours at work where I could, but it still wasn't enough to cover everything. That's when I started exploring other options. I researched side gigs, applied for freelance opportunities, and even considered renting out a room in the house. It was exhausting, but it felt good to be proactive, to take control of a situation that had once seemed hopeless. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was too quiet and the weight of it all felt unbearable, I'd wonder if I was fighting a losing battle. Maybe David was right. Maybe selling the house was my only option. But every time those thoughts crossed my mind, I'd remind myself of one simple truth. This house was all I had left. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of my independence, my resilience, and my determination to move forward. One evening, as I was sorting through a box of old papers, I came across something that gave me pause. It was a copy of the deed to the house, along with documentation from when we'd paid off the mortgage. As I read through the papers, a thought began to form in the back of my mind, an idea that could change everything. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was worth exploring. If David thought he could come back and take the house from me, he was in for a surprise. For now, though, I focused on the small victories. Every bill paid, every item sold, and every step forward was proof that I could do this. David might have tried to take everything from me, but I wasn't going to let him win. Deep down, I knew he wasn't done. He would come back, and when he did, I needed to be ready. But for the first time, I wasn't scared. I was determined. This was my house, my life, and I was going to protect it, no matter what. It didn't take long for David to make his next move. About a month after he'd left, my phone rang one afternoon, and his name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him stew in whatever mess he'd created for himself. But curiosity and the nagging sense that this call was about to escalate things won out. I answered, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want, David?" His tone was smug, almost gleeful, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "We need to talk about the house," he said. "It's not fair for you to keep it all to yourself. We'll sell it and split the profits. It's only fair." Fair? The word hit me like a slap in the face. This was the same man who had drained our accounts, left me with barely enough to scrape by, and thought he could waltz back in to claim half of the one thing he hadn't taken. "Fair," I repeated, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. "You think it's fair to leave me with nothing and then demand I sell the house so you can pocket half the money?" "Don't be dramatic," he said dismissively. "We both contributed to that house. I'm entitled to my share." I wanted to scream at him, to unleash all the frustration and rage that had been building since the day he left. But instead, I forced myself to take a deep breath. "I'll think about it," I said, my tone cool and detached. David didn't seem to notice the edge in my voice. "Good," he said, as if he'd already won. "I'll be in touch." What he didn't know was that I'd already hired a lawyer. My attorney, Lisa, was everything I needed and more. From the moment I walked in her office, she exuded confidence and competence. Her no-nonsense demeanor was both reassuring and energizing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I laid everything out for her. The drained accounts, the unpaid bills, David's sudden reappearance to demand the house. She listened carefully, her sharp eyes narrowing as I described his actions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "He's banking on the idea that you'll roll over and give him what he wants," she said. "But here's the thing. He doesn't have as much leverage as he thinks he does." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. Lisa pulled out a notepad and started jotting down notes. "First, we need to look at the deed to the house. If you contributed significantly more than he did, or if the mortgage was paid off with your money, we can argue that it's primarily your asset. Second, we'll document every expense you've covered since he left. Property taxes, utilities, maintenance, all of it, He can't just walk away from those responsibilities and still expect to claim half. Her confidence was contagious, and I left her office feeling more hopeful than I had in months. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to build my case. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find: bank statements, receipts, and records of the payments I'd made toward the house. Lisa also had me draft a timeline of events, detailing everything David had done since he left. She wanted to establish a pattern of neglect and irresponsibility, which she said would strengthen our argument. Meanwhile, David continued to push for a sale. He called me several times, each conversation more infuriating than the last. "You're just dragging this out," he said during one particularly heated call. "Let's sell the house and move on. You're only making this harder on yourself." "I'm not making anything harder," I replied calmly. "I'm just taking the time to make sure everything is done properly." David's arrogance was infuriating, but it also worked in my favor. He was so confident that he had the upper hand that he didn't bother preparing for the possibility that I might fight back. The day finally came when we had to meet in mediation. David strolled into the room with a cocky grin, as if he'd already won. But when Lisa started laying out our case, detailing my contributions to the house, his financial abandonment, and the clear paper trail proving that I had covered all expenses since he left, his confidence began to waver. "What about the joint accounts?" he blurted out, trying to regain his footing. "I'm entitled to half of that, too." Lisa didn't miss a beat. "Those accounts were drained entirely by your client," she told the mediator. "My client received nothing from those funds and will be seeking compensation for her share." David's face turned red, and for the first time, I saw a genuine panic in his eyes. When the session ended, I walked out of that room feeling lighter than I had in months. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Lisa assured me that we were on solid ground. "He's used to getting his way," she said as we left the building. "But people like him don't know how to handle it when someone stands up to them." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was fighting back. David might have thought he could walk all over me, but he was about to learn the hard way that I wasn't the same person he'd left behind. This house was mine, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. While Lisa handled the legal battle, I turned my attention to a secret I'd kept tucked away for years. David thought he knew everything about our finances and assets, but he didn't know about the one thing I'd kept entirely to myself: my grandmother's cabin. It was a beautiful, secluded property nestled in the mountains, surrounded by towering pines and a small, crystal-clear lake. I had spent summers there as a child, fishing with my grandfather and watching the stars come alive at night. When my grandmother passed away 10 years ago, she left the cabin to me. At the time, I hadn't given it much thought. David and I were busy building our lives together, and the cabin felt like a relic from another time, a piece of my past that didn't fit into my present. I kept it maintained, but hadn't visited often, and I never mentioned it to David. It wasn't out of mistrust. It just felt like something personal, something that was mine and mine alone. Now, that cabin felt like a lifeline. If the house was my shield, the cabin was my sword, an ace in the hole that could change everything. I dug through old files until I found the paperwork for the property. The cabin wasn't just sentimental, it was valuable. Over the years, the area had become a hotspot for vacationers, and property values had skyrocketed. I ran a quick search online and found listings for similar cabins in the area. If I wanted to sell, I could easily net a six-figure sum, enough to not only secure my financial future, but also deliver a devastating blow to David's plans. But I wasn't ready to sell just yet. The cabin meant too much to me to let it go so easily. Instead, I decided to use it as leverage. If David thought he could bleed me dry and walk away with half the house, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I called Lisa to update her on my discovery. "I've been keeping something in my back pocket," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's a cabin I inherited from my grandmother. David doesn't know about it." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lisa responded, her voice calm but sharp with interest. "Tell me more." I explained the details, the location, the value, and the fact that it had always been in my name. "I never thought it mattered," I admitted. "But now I think it could be useful." Lisa didn't hesitate. "It's more than useful," she said. "This changes everything. If we can show that you have independent assets he wasn't entitled to, it strengthens your position even further. It's not just about the cabin. It's about proving you're capable of standing on your own." Her words filled me with a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in months. For so long, I'd been playing defense, reacting to David's betrayals, and trying to hold on to what little I had left. But now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to take control. Over the next few weeks, I worked quietly but diligently to prepare. I updated the cabin's records, ensuring that everything was in order. I also reached out to a local property manager to explore the possibility of renting it out as a vacation home. If I wasn't ready to sell, I could at least generate income from it. Meanwhile, David continued his attempts to pressure me into selling the house. His calls became more frequent, and his tone grew increasingly impatient. "We both know you can't afford to keep it," he said during one conversation. "Why drag this out? Just sell it and move on." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to tell him exactly where he could shove his unsolicited advice. Instead, I played it cool. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my tone neutral. What I didn't tell him was that I was already 2 steps ahead. One day, I drove up to the cabin for the first time in years. The winding road through the mountains felt familiar, yet foreign, like a path I'd walked in another life. When I arrived, the sight of the cabin took my breath away. It was exactly as I remembered, cozy, charming, and full of potential. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the view of the lake was nothing short of magical. Standing on the porch, I felt a surge of clarity. This cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol of everything I'd lost, and everything I still had the power to reclaim. David thought he could take everything from me, but he didn't know about the strength I had hidden away. With Lisa by my side and the cabin as my ace, I was finally ready to face him head on. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't playing defense. I was going to fight for what was mine and win. The morning of the court date felt surreal. I woke up before dawn, my stomach twisting with a mix of nerves and determination. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for since David first walked out. I knew the stakes were high, but I also knew I wasn't walking into that courtroom unarmed. Lisa and I had built a strong case, and I trusted her to fight for me as fiercely as I was ready to fight for myself. When I arrived at the courthouse, Lisa was already there, calm and composed as ever. "You've got this," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Just remember, the truth is on your side." David showed up a few minutes later, his lawyer in tow. He was dressed in an expensive suit and wore the same smug expression I'd seen so many times before, as if he'd already won. He didn't even look at me as he walked past, his focus entirely on his phone. That smugness only fueled my resolve. He thought this was going to be easy, but he had no idea what was coming. The hearing began with the usual formalities, the judge reviewing the case and both sides presenting their initial arguments. David's lawyer leaned heavily on the idea that the house was a shared marital asset and should be sold, with the proceeds split equally. "Mr. and Mrs., your last name, purchased the property together during their marriage," his lawyer said, glancing briefly at me. "As such, it is reasonable to assume that both parties have an equal claim to the property." David sat back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk creeping onto his face. It was clear he thought this was a done deal. But Lisa was ready. When it was her turn to speak, she stood confidently and began laying out the facts. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "while it's true that the house was purchased during the marriage, the funds used to pay off the mortgage did not come from joint assets. They came from my client's personal inheritance, which was explicitly excluded from marital property under the terms of the inheritance agreement." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Do you have documentation to support this claim?" Lisa nodded. "I do, Your Honor." She handed over a folder containing bank statements, inheritance records, and receipts showing the payments made toward the house. "As you can see, the funds used to pay off the mortgage were deposited directly into a separate account in my client's name before being applied to the loan. At no point were these funds commingled with joint assets." The courtroom fell silent as the judge reviewed the documents. I glanced at David, whose confident smirk had started to falter. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering something urgently, but it was clear the wind had been knocked out of his sails. Lisa wasn't done. "Furthermore," she continued, "my client has covered all expenses related to the property since Mr. your last name left, including property taxes, utilities, and maintenance. These are not insignificant amounts, Your Honor, and they demonstrate her continued investment in and responsibility for the property." David tried to argue, his voice tinged with frustration. "That's not fair. We both lived in that house for years. It's not like she paid for all of it herself." Lisa remained unflappable. "Your Honor, while Mr. your last name did contribute to the initial purchase of the home, the majority of the financial burden has fallen on my client, particularly in recent years. Additionally, Mr. your last name has already withdrawn significant joint funds without my client's consent, leaving her in a precarious financial situation. The judge turned to David's lawyer. Do you have any evidence to refute these claims? David's lawyer fumbled for a response, but ultimately shook his head. No, Your Honor. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the house was primarily financed and maintained through Mrs., your last name, S. individual efforts. Therefore, I rule that the property shall remain solely in her possession. I barely heard the rest of the ruling, my mind spinning with relief and disbelief. The judge ordered David to repay a portion of the funds he had taken from our accounts, citing his financial misconduct as a factor in the decision. As the hearing ended, I stole a glance at David. His face was a mix of shock and anger, his confident facade completely shattered. For the first time, I saw him for what he really was, a man who had underestimated me and lost because of it. Lisa walked over to me, a triumphant smile on her face. You did it, she said, patting my shoulder. No, I replied, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. We did it. As I left the courthouse, the weight I'd been carrying for months finally began to lift. The fight wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about reclaiming my life. And for the first time, I felt like I was winning. David thought he could take everything from me, but he was wrong. This was my victory, and it was only the beginning. The courthouse hallway was quiet except for the soft shuffle of footsteps and murmured conversations. The hearing had just ended, and I stood near the exit, clutching my bag as I tried to process everything that had happened. The ruling was in my favor. The house was mine, and David's attempt to take it had failed. I was about to leave when I heard his voice behind me. You think you've won? I turned to see David storming toward me, his face flushed with anger. His once smug demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a simmering fury that was almost comical. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This isn't over, he spat, his voice low but venomous. For a split second, I felt a flicker of the old fear, the same fear that had gripped me when he drained our accounts and left me with nothing. But then I remembered the courtroom, the judge's ruling, and Lisa's calm, steady confidence. I thought about everything I'd fought for, everything I'd reclaimed. The fear evaporated. It is over, David, I said, my voice firm and unwavering. You don't control me anymore. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of power that I hadn't realized I'd lost. David opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he glared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and frustration. You've made a mistake, he said finally, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. You're going to regret this. I shook my head, a small, calm smile spreading across my face. No, David. The only mistake I made was letting you think you could treat me like this. He stood there for a moment, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. As I watched him go, I expected to feel a rush of satisfaction or vindication, but instead, I felt something else. Pity. For all his arrogance and bravado, David was just a man who couldn't handle losing. He had built his life around control, controlling our marriage, our finances, and even my sense of self-worth. And now that he'd lost that control, he didn't know who he was. It was almost sad. Almost. I turned away and walked toward the exit, the weight of his threats sliding off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt free, not just from David, but from the fear and doubt he'd planted in me. Outside, the sun was shining, and the crisp air felt like a fresh start. I took a deep breath and let the moment sink in. This wasn't just about winning the house or getting a portion of the money back. This was about reclaiming my life and proving to myself that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. As I walked to my car, I thought about everything that had led me to this point. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the endless nights of worry. It had all been worth it. Not because it was fair or right, but because it had forced me to grow in ways I never thought I could. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my house, I felt a peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The house no longer felt like a battleground or a symbol of what I'd lost. It felt like mine. David was right about one thing. I had changed, but it wasn't the kind of change he'd expected. I wasn't weaker, angrier, or more bitter. I was stronger, calmer, and more in control of my own destiny than I'd ever been. His threats didn't scare me anymore, because I finally understood something he never would. True power comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it away. And that was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The legal battle with David had been draining, but when the judge's gavel fell and the ruling came down in my favor, it felt like a new chapter had begun. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally breathe. The house was mine, and with that victory came a sense of ownership, not just over the property, but over my life. The first thing I did was start transforming the house. For years, it had been a shared space, filled with compromises and David's influence. The furniture was picked with his tastes in mind, the walls painted in colors he liked, and the decorations reflected his idea of what a home should look like. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized how much of myself I had given up to fit into his vision. I made a list of changes I wanted to make. Some were small, a fresh coat of paint on the walls, new curtains for the windows. Others were bigger, replacing the worn-out living room furniture, ripping up the carpet in the hallway, and turning the guest room into a cozy library. Each project was like peeling away another layer of the past, leaving behind something that felt entirely mine. One weekend, I tackled the garden. David had always insisted on keeping it meticulously trimmed and neat, but I wanted something wilder, more colorful. I dug up the boring shrubs and planted flowers in every shade I could find: bright yellows, deep purples, fiery reds. By the end of the day, I was covered in dirt and exhausted, but the sight of that vibrant garden made it all worth it. I didn't stop there. I painted the front door a bold teal, replaced the outdated light fixtures in the hallway, and hung up artwork that made me smile every time I looked at it. Slowly but surely, the house stopped feeling like a reminder of what I'd lost and started feeling like a celebration of everything I'd reclaimed. The changes weren't just physical. With the house finally feeling like my own, I decided it was time to focus on rebuilding myself, too. For years, I had put off therapy, convincing myself I didn't need it. But after everything that had happened, I knew I couldn't move forward without confronting the pain I'd been carrying. My first therapy session was nerve-wracking. Sitting across from a stranger and laying my emotions bare felt vulnerable and uncomfortable, but my therapist, Dr. Caldwell, had a way of making me feel heard without judgment. We started unpacking the layers of my marriage, peeling back the memories and behaviors I'd ignored or justified for so long. "You didn't just lose a husband," she said during one session. "You lost a version of yourself, the one who believed she wasn't enough without him. Rebuilding isn't about going back to who you were before. It's about creating someone stronger, someone who knows her worth." Her words stuck with me, and over time, therapy became a place where I could be honest not just about what David had done, but about the ways I had let myself shrink to fit into his world. As the months passed, I started to notice small but significant changes. I stopped second-guessing myself so much. I spoke up more at work, volunteered for projects, and even negotiated a raise, a step that would have terrified me before. I also reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. At first, I worried they wouldn't understand what I'd been through, but their support was overwhelming. "We're just glad to have you back," one of them said, giving me a hug that felt like coming home. Little by little, I started filling my life with things that made me happy. I joined a local book club, started taking yoga classes on the weekends, and even signed up for a painting workshop. It wasn't about staying busy. It was about rediscovering the parts of myself I'd forgotten. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when the silence of the house felt too loud, and the memories of what had happened threatened to pull me under. But every time those feelings surfaced, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. The garden outside my window, the cozy library upstairs, the walls painted in colors that made me feel alive. All of it was proof that I was moving forward. For so long, I had let David's betrayal define me, but now, I was learning to define myself. And while the journey wasn't over, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the woman who had been left behind. I was stronger. I was whole. And for the first time in a long time, I was happy. A year after the divorce, I woke up one morning to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, a peaceful calm settling over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of sadness or anger when I thought about the past. Instead, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for: happiness. Life had changed in so many ways since the day David walked out. After the legal battles, the therapy sessions, and the long nights of doubt, I had finally found a rhythm that felt right. I had a new job, nothing glamorous, but fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. It gave me structure, a sense of purpose, and a chance to use my skills in ways that made a difference. The friendships I'd rebuilt and the new connections I'd formed became the foundation of a support system I hadn't realized I needed. My book club turned into a group of close friends who encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone. One of them, Claire, even dragged me to a pottery class, where I discovered a surprising love for creating messy, lopsided bowls. David had tried to contact me a few times in the months following the court ruling. The first message came through email, an attempt at an apology that felt more like an effort to clear his own conscience than a genuine acknowledgement of what he'd done. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how things ended," he'd written. "I hope we can move past it someday." I didn't respond. What was the point? His words couldn't undo the damage he'd caused or erase the months of pain I'd endured. The next time, he sent a text. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing well." It was short, almost casual, as if he expected me to reply as if nothing had happened. I deleted it without a second thought. David was a part of my past, and that's where he belonged. I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. Moving on meant letting go completely, and I was determined to keep walking forward. One crisp autumn evening, I decided to visit my grandmother's cabin for the first time in years. The drive up to the mountains was long, but beautiful, the trees bursting with reds, oranges, and yellows that painted the landscape like a postcard. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered, small and unassuming, with its weathered wooden porch and the faint smell of pine lingering in the air. It was a piece of my past that had somehow remained untouched, a reminder of simpler times and the unconditional love my grandmother had given me. I stepped onto the porch, the old boards creaking softly beneath my feet, and gazed out at the mountains in the distance. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the lake and filling the sky with shades of pink and lavender. As I stood there, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This cabin wasn't just a reminder of where I'd come from. It was a testament to how far I'd come. It represented resilience, strength, and the power of starting over. Sitting on the porch swing, I let myself reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight to reclaim my life. It had all been painful, but it had also been transformative. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, standing in that empty house and wondering how I was going to survive. She didn't know yet how strong she was or how much she was capable of. But she found out, one step at a time. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I was no longer defined by what David had done or the life we'd shared. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece, into someone stronger, wiser, and more whole. And as I watched the stars begin to appear in the night sky, I knew one thing for sure. The best was yet to come. It's strange how life works. A year ago, I thought my world had ended. I couldn't see beyond the betrayal, the empty accounts, and the wreckage of my marriage. I felt small, broken, and unmoored, like everything I'd built had been swept away by a storm. But now, as I sit in the home I fought so hard to keep, surrounded by the life I've rebuilt, I realized that storm wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Looking back, I can see it all clearly now. David thought he could strip me of everything. My sense of security, my stability, and even my dignity. He drained our accounts, demanded the house, and acted as though I was nothing without him. For a while, I believed him. I let his actions define me, let his betrayal consume me. But somewhere along the way, I found something I didn't know I had: resilience. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when I wanted to curl up in bed and let the world pass me by. But every time I thought about giving up, I reminded myself of what I was fighting for. Not just the house or the finances, but my sense of self. I made mistakes along the way. There were moments when I doubted my choices, when I questioned whether I was strong enough to move forward. But those moments taught me something important. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, over and over again, no matter how many times you stumble. The legal battle, the therapy, the night spent painting walls and planting flowers. They were all steps toward reclaiming my life. Each small victory, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time, was a building block for something greater. And David? He's a distant memory now, a figure from a past that no longer defines me. He reached out a few times, but I never responded. Not out of anger or spite, but because I didn't need closure from him. I had found my own. It's ironic, really. He thought he could take everything from me, but in the end, he only gave me the push I needed to take control of my life. If he hadn't left, if he hadn't tried to dismantle everything I'd built, I might never have discovered how strong I am. I used to hate him for what he did, but now I feel nothing but indifference. His actions were the catalyst, but my growth was all mine. Sitting here now, I can see how far I've come. The house, once a reminder of pain, is now a place of comfort and joy. The garden outside my window bursts with color, a testament to the new life I've created. The friends I've made, the hobbies I've discovered, and the peace I've found within myself. They're all part of a life I never imagined I could have. I still visit my grandmother's cabin from time to time. It's my sanctuary, a place where I can reflect and reconnect with the parts of myself I'd forgotten. Standing on that porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, I feel a sense of clarity and gratitude that words can't fully capture. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every tear, every sleepless night, and every moment of doubt. It taught me that I'm capable of so much more than I ever gave myself credit for. Funny how things work out, isn't it? Sometimes the worst things in life turn out to be blessings in disguise. David thought he was ending my story, but all he did was help me write a new chapter. One that's brighter, stronger, and more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. And the best part? This is just the beginning.